Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to the next session of the conference, Perspectives from Corporate Leaders. I'm pleased you all got back into the facility very promptly. Let's hope we can keep it on track. The program says that this session will be moderated by Kenneth Medlock, but unfortunately Ken is ill. So he asked me to moderate for him this morning. So Ken and I do a lot of work together, so it was natural for him to ask me to moderate the session. My name is Peter Hartley. I'm a Rice Fellow with the Baker Institute, a Rice Scholar, I think it's officially called, with the Baker Institute in Energy Policy Studies. And I'm also teach the Environmental Economics class here at Rice, the undergraduate class. So I was going to sort of spend a couple of moments introducing the session and maybe say something that may be a little bit off-key, perhaps, in the sense that it's sort of interesting that a lot of economists who've studied this issue have really, sort of environmental economists, I should say, have argued for taxes rather than tradable emission permits as the way to handle CO2 emissions. And to a lot of people who are not environmental economists, they wonder why that might be the case, because a lot of economists, of course, advocated market measures in general for handling environmental externalities, including, of course, especially the case of the SO2 permit market in the United States. And a lot of environmental economists who studied the SO2 market have presented a lot of evidence that it has been very effective at controlling SO2 and much more efficient than what went before. So which raises the question, why might the same environmental economists, in fact the SO2 market I should say, was cited as a reason for using marketable permits for the case of CO2. So it's sort of an interesting question, why might a lot of environmental economists who've been very supportive of using marketable permits for SO2 be a little bit more ambiguous in their support for using marketable permits for CO2. And at the risk of saying something that's a bit too complicated, I've taken a slide from my environmental economics class to sort of explain what's going on in this approach. So what we have here is a level of emissions of something, in this case could be SO2 or CO2 along the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis we've graphed either damages or the cost of control. You think here of these curves are labelled MS, the marginal savings from being allowed to emit. But if you read it in this dimension, it represents the marginal cost of reducing emissions. And along this axis, we have the marginal damage. In principle, if we knew the marginal costs of controlling emissions, then we could either use a quantitative limit on emissions or else a price, putting a price on emissions, and either one would achieve the same outcome. The problem is that we don't really know what the costs of control are, the costs of controlling emissions are. There's uncertainty about that. And in particular, with CO2, part of these costs of control would include alternatives like sequestering the CO2 instead of actually reducing emissions, which really adds to the uncertainty. Okay, so then we've got the situation, so we may have different costs of control here represented by these different curves. And if we think this is the expected cost of control, we could either use a level of emission permits E star or a price P star. And if we get it wrong, so here is the dotted line represents the expected cost of control. If the actual costs of control are much higher, if we have emission permits, actually there's a loss involved here. We have the wrong level. The level should be where the two curves intersect. If we have the wrong level of emissions, we have a loss represented by the yellow triangle. And if we have the wrong price, we have a loss represented by the orange triangle. And if you look at these two different diagrams, what you'll notice is that the relative costs associated with permits versus fees or taxes depend on the relative slopes of these two lines. So if we have a very steeply sloped cost of control, the costs from permits can be very, very high. Or conversely, if you have a very shallowly sloped marginal damage curve, then the cost from taxes will be much lower. So whether you favour permits or taxes should really depend on the relative slopes of these two sets of curves. And the point is that for SO2, generally we think that the marginal damage curve is going to be very, very steeply sloped, right? Because basically you increase the amount of SO2 right now, it can be very, very damaging. It has immediate consequences, health consequences and so on. Whereas for CO2, we expect the gradual build-up of CO2 as the problem, then this marginal damage curve is likely to be much flatter. Conversely, with respect to the marginal costs of control, for SO2 there are lots of alternative ways of reducing SO2 emissions. You can use different kinds of fuels, put in scrubbers, change technologies in lots of ways, which makes the marginal cost of control much flatter. But with carbon dioxide there are not very many alternatives, so the marginal cost is very steep. The consequence is that we might expect to favour a tax actually for CO2, even though we favour permits for SO2. And this is actually a point that's made its way into the undergraduate textbooks these days and talking about it. But having said that, I know that sort of it's not really well, I say it's a discordant note, it's not really the preferred method people are talking about. One reason for that, I would argue, is that politicians actually prefer permits. Part of the reason is their fingerprints are less on the subsequent increase in energy prices than would be the case if they put a tax on. But also it provides lots of opportunities to do special favours to people if you're handing out permits to different groups. The other thing is that one could argue that a lot of economists looking at actually how these permit systems have worked have been quite alarmed at exactly what's happened with a lot of these offset mechanisms in third world countries. There's been a recent report from Stanford showing that a lot of these projects actually have been of doubtful validity. And the other problem is different rules and regulations make it difficult to ensure global least cost control and to sort of have a uniform trading of these emissions. Anyway, these are just a few remarks, but what we want to do is we're going to hear from some experts about this, and I'm going to introduce our speakers for this panel. And the first presenter is Zin Smarty, who's President and CEO of Suez Energy North America Inc. And prior to joining Suez, he held various executive positions in several other energy companies, including BP, Emeco Global Power, Emeco Power, Arco, and npower UK. I'd like to welcome Mr. Smarty first, please. Here's your presentations.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Neil. Thank you to Rice University for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this morning. It's highly topical, given that we're in Houston, the energy capital of the world. I think from a timing perspective, it's also excellent. They obviously timed it well, given that President-elect Obama is going to announce his team today. So this is actually very good today. What I really wanted to do is, if I may, first tell you about my company. It's actually GDF Suez, not Suez, so it's not to do publicity about the company. It's a fairly new name, so I thought maybe I can spend 3 or 4 minutes to tell you who we are. Then talk about some initiatives that are ongoing in the United States. You know, we do have a lot of things going on in the United States. Maybe just go briefly through them. What are we actually doing today in terms of climate change? And then talk about the concept of energy and environment at a crossroads. What is actually going on? And then what is our company doing about climate change? And finally, talk a little bit about some of the new initiatives that people are talking about, what they need to include. So GDF Suez, it's a fairly new company. We were born only on the 22nd of July of this year by merging 2 companies, GDF and Suez. GDF stands for Gaz de France. It's a very large gas company in France and in Europe. Suez is a very large energy company active around the world. So if you look at us today, we are probably one of the largest, if not the largest, electricity and gas company in the world, with a market cap well over $100 billion. At least that was on Friday. I can't assure you what is the market cap today. In terms of revenues, over $100 billion. We have 200,000 people active around the world. We are one of the leaders in terms of natural gas around the world. In terms of LNG, we are the world leader in LNG with very strong position in the Atlantic Basin, especially here in North America. In terms of power generation, we are the largest independent power player in the world, fifth largest in Europe, and the second largest in France. Very difficult to be number one in France when you have somebody like EDF there. And also, we really are unique in many ways. We are active along all the elements of the value chain. We are active in the E&P business. We are active in the LNG, power generation, marketing and trading, and selling electricity and gas to consumers. Power generation, which is really the focus of my discussion today. So in terms of talking about climate change, I really want to bring it back to power generation. And if you look at GDF Suez, we have over 60,000 megawatt of power generation, which is quite a lot, but 80% of our generation either is carbon-free or carbon light. So 30% of what we do is either nuclear and hydropower. We are a significant player in terms of nuclear energy. Most of what we own is in Belgium. Hydropower, significant player in France and also in Brazil. We are the largest private hydro player in Brazil. And then natural gas, which is fairly carbon light, and that's what we do. So 80% of our generation is carbon-free or carbon-light. We are a recognized leader in terms of many things. We are ranked number 8 in the field of sustainable development, and we have been called one of the most accountable big companies. We are also a valued member of Advanced Sustainable Performance Index, and in fact, many firms' top investment are in GDF Suez. Let's talk a little bit about some of the initiatives ongoing in the United States. I'm sure that a lot of people have heard about renewable portfolio standards. Because of a lack of federal, policy, a lot of states decided to have these RPS, renewable portfolio standards. It's quite simple, really. What they're saying is they really want a certain amount of their generation to come from renewables. If you look at the state of Texas, for example, Texas said that they wanted around 5,000 megawatt by 2015 to come from a renewable. And in fact, they increased that or double it to 10,000 megawatt to come from a renewable by 2025. If you look at California, a lot more challenging in terms of target, 20% to come from a renewable by 2010 and 33% to come from a renewable by 2020. That is really significant. So here we are saying that if you are a seller of electricity in one of these states, you need to make sure that you buy your electricity before you sell it to the final consumer, buy it from renewable sources, which means that it is encouraging people to build renewable energy. And this RPS means that there is a cost or in fact an advantage if you build these renewable energy forms, so you have incentives to do so. The second policy, I guess, which exists also, these RPS tend to be at the state level, but at a regional level, you have RGGI. I'm sure that everybody has heard now of Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which started recently. Round 1 of the auctions took place back in September. And there we've seen, it's a modest target, clearly, but the cost or the price of CO2 in the first auction was around $3 a ton. And if you look at the results of the next round, it'll be a little bit higher than that, $4.30. So what we are seeing now is that because we don't have a federal initiative, we've seen that RGGI, which is mostly the states in the Northeast, have adopted it. There's an auction process there now. And now states on the West have their own initiative, which is a WCI, which is essentially saying that they too want to reduce greenhouse gases via some sort of cap and trade mechanism. That's really important. It's a start, and it will help in the future. So what does that mean? If you want to build, remember I told you about RPS in particular, if you want to build today, let's say wind farm, there are a lot of things that you can do. But today, let's take the example of Texas. If you want to build a wind farm, the cost of building this wind farm is around $2,200 per kW, which means that to build a 100 megawatt wind farm, it costs you $220 million. Of course, if you build it, you want to recover your investment and hopefully make some money. The issue is this. Remember, this is in Texas. So what you have a number of things that will help you to recover your investment. You have the price of electricity itself, energy when you sell it. You have the REC, which is essentially an incentive to build wind farm. Then you have various costs associated with that. And then you have also production tax credit, which means that the federal government enables or allows people who build wind-fired generation to pay essentially less tax. So if you look at the state of Texas, when you put the forward curves or the price of electricity in the future, and you took all the incentives together, what you would get is $2,111 per kW. So essentially, it does not make sense at all to build a wind farm in the state of Texas. That is not the case everywhere else. Clearly in Massachusetts, in New England, because the RECs are much higher, in Texas they are around $1 per megawatt hour. In the state of Massachusetts, it's close to $50 per megawatt hours. There, this is positive, and therefore you're able to win wind farm if you wish to. The only problem is that from a permitting perspective, it's very difficult to permit a wind farm in the state of Massachusetts. It's a lot easier to do it in Texas, but you won't make money there. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight to you. Although we have all these incentives, it is quite difficult to build these renewable energies that people talk about a lot. And in addition to that, remember also, when you're building these wind farms, especially in the state of Texas, you're building them in the West where really people don't live there. So you have to bring them to population centers, Dallas and Houston. It means that you have to invest significantly in transmission line to bring them to population center. And that's another cost that's actually not taken into account here as well. That's from a production tax credit perspective. I also wanted to highlight, I think everybody is very familiar with the McKinsey chart, did very, very good work. A lot of people tend to focus on the right-hand side. And what I wanted to highlight to you here is a number of things. If you are really focusing on the right-hand side here, the x-axis is the amount of CO2 that is saved and the cost of actually doing it. So what it says is that maybe the focus should be on the right-hand side. There are a lot of things you can do on the efficiency side that will help you significantly, change your light bulbs, etc., which have a negative cost, versus trying to invest in new renewable or CCS, etc., etc. However, obviously the amount of CO2 will not be huge. So at some point you have to move further to the right. The calculation that they've done is at $50 per CO2, a ton of CO2, the emissions can be reduced by between 3 and 4.5 billion tons. This is by 2030. Remember that today in the United States we emit around 6 billion tons of CO2. We expect that by 2030 we'll have 10 billion tons. So if you do everything and spend around, let's call it $50 a ton, which is well ahead of $100 billion, you will be able to reduce emission by between 3 to 4.5 billion tons. So it means by 2030 we'll be back to where we are today. That's a very important, very significant graph to bear in mind. I want to come back again to the power generation again and tell you that in the United States we have 1,000 gigawatt of power generation today, installed capacity. And if you look at the projections in the future, clearly to stand still in the United States, if you have a 2% increase in GDP, I know it's very challenging to have 2% increase in GDP today, but by 2011, 2012, we'll go back to 2%, 3% increase in GDP. That means if you stand still, you need 20 gigawatt of new generation just to keep pace with GDP growth. So that means if you don't invest at all in new generation, the reserve margin or the difference between supply and demand will be coming down significantly to the point where you will need new generation. Reserve margin will end up being around 15% by 2010, 2011. that is a time when you really must invest in power generation. And remember, power generation, you have to make the investment now because it takes 3 to 4 years to actually have a power plant operating. Maybe even more. Depends what kind of technology you choose. So situation is not as easy as what some people might think. This is at a global level in the United States. But what's really more important is if you look at it at a regional level, where here it's the state of Massachusetts again, or let's say New England. In New England, it's a little worse than that. Reserve margin are forecasted to be around 3% if nothing is going to be done about them by 2013. So although things may not look that bad from a US perspective, it's not actually as easy from a regional perspective or a state perspective. There is a significant need for new generation to come as quickly as possible. So you say, okay, what is the problem? Let's build more generation. Let me tell you what the problem is. The problem is this. If you look at the cost of new generation, and this is the range of cost, if you look at the cost of CCGT, for example, it varies between $1,000 per kW to around $2,200 per kW. So it means to build a 1,000 megawatt power plant is going to cost you maybe $2,000, even $2.5 billion to build it. If you are building a nuclear facility, which is right at the bottom there, well, the cost could be from $5,000 to $8,000. So a 1,000 megawatt nuclear facility will cost you either between $5 billion and $8 billion. Significant cost. Talking about big money building these power plants. And remember, the United States has 1,000 gigawatt of capacity. So you say, okay, well, that's fine. The cost is very high, but can I still build it? The answer is not really. Because if we want to invest today in power generation, and we do, that's our business, we look at the forward curves. We look, okay, what's the price over the next 3 years so that I can hedge or be able to sell my output? And I'll go to a market which is a competitive market, which has both electricity, energy price as well as capacity price. Let's again pick New England. So what is the forward curve? I converted it into units so that it's all the same in terms of dollars per kilowatt month. It says that energy is it's around $9 or $10 per kilowatt month. Then you can add capacity on the top, and you get to around $12. So the total, what you would get if you invest today is $12 per kW month. However, if you invest in CCGT, which is one of the lower cost, you invest $1,400 per kW, it means that you're not able to recover your investment. There's a gap there. There's a deficit of $5.50 per kilowatt month to invest in the CCGT. So you will not be able to recover your cost today if you want to invest in CCGT. If you want to invest in coal or nuclear, it's even worse. Forgetting about the cost of CO2 at this stage. I'm just talking about it from perspective of building a new generation, regardless of the type of generation. I picked gas-fired generation here. The reason I'm talking about gas-fired because it's usually quicker to do it. It takes a little bit less time in terms of building it, and the cost is a little bit less as well. Now, okay, so it's very difficult to build new gas-fired power generation or any generation for that matter, so we could build a renewable. Remember what I told you about a renewable? It's actually challenging to build it in some areas, but you can actually do it. Having said that, can you build really everything from wind and solar energy? The answer is not really. You know why? Because all these wind farms and solar energy, they have a capacity factor of around 30%. What that means, it means that they only generate 30% of the time. You know, it's windy at night, maybe sometime during the day, but it's not always windy. Therefore, the wind turbine is not always operating. Okay, so remember, what you want to replace maybe is coal-fired power generation, which operates all the time, 90% capacity factor, with wind farm, which only operates 30-40% of the time. So you really you need to invest, in addition to wind farm, you probably need to have gas peaking facilities to help you with that. So the investment is not only in wind farms, but in gas generation, and then you have to get it to population centers, so transmission line as well. So being able to essentially flood the United States geography with wind farms, even if it was possible to permit them, is not that straightforward. The cost will be huge indeed. But a lot of people say, well, something will save us, which is gas. It's not as carbon intensive as coal. You know, there's some truth in that. The truth is that if you look at what we built in the United States over the past 10 years, a lot of it was gas-fired generation. In fact, we built 200 gigawatt of new generation. A lot of that really was coming from gas-fired generation. But we had to import a lot of LNG. The situation is changing. In the United States, we've been able to find a lot of non-conventional gas. There's some truth in that. And we believe that if gas prices were to be at around $8, $9 per MMBTU, you'll be able to get at least another 6 or 7 BCF a day of new gas. So there is quite a bit of gas, provided that gas prices stay at a certain level. If gas prices were to come down, then it's unlikely that people will be able to get all the gas that is needed. And let's come back to coal, because that's really important here. Well, if you look at the CO2 emission here, we have, 40% of the emissions are coming from the electricity sector. And if you look at the electricity sector, that's 40%. If you look at the electricity sector, 30% of our generation is from coal. But remember, that's capacity. In fact, if you look at actual generation, it's 60% or so generation is from coal. And if you look at the entire generation from electricity here, 80% of the emissions come from coal. So 40% is from the electricity sector, and 80% of the generation is from coal, and coal is a little bit everywhere. So you say, okay, if we can reduce the amount of coal, then I could reduce my emissions. Okay, let's do this test. Here is essentially dispatch curve. It's very simple. It says that you will dispatch the lowest cost generation first, and then the mid-merit generation and the most expensive one. Today, the lowest cost generation tend to be nuclear or coal. And then you have gas-fired generation, and then the rest. So you say, it's very simple. Let me just increase the CO2 cost up to a certain point where I can change the dispatch so that I have gas generating first and then coal. So let's add a $30 per megawatt hour cost. So if you add $30, you move this cost curve up here. But remember, gas also has some carbon. So by imposing $30 per ton in terms of CO2 cost, you're increasing your generation by $30 for coal, but you increase your generation by $12 for gas. So what you've done, even with $30, you really haven't shifted the dispatch curve. All you've done was to increase cost for almost everybody. Okay, then you say, well, why don't I just keep increasing price? Yes, I think you can. The problem is this. If you increase your price, the coal energy margin will go down, so you make less money from coal. So coal will not be generating, so the capacity factor will come down. So what happened? Gas will generate more, great. Gas prices will go up, okay. So coal energy margins will also go up, because remember, gas prices went up, now you're back to the same dispatch curve. Coal capacity factors will go up, so you're back into this do loop whereby you want to increase the cost of coal, but by increasing the cost of CO2, by increasing it, you increase the amount of gas that's being generated. That means gas prices will go up. And guess what happened? Coal will become a little bit more, or a little bit cheaper. You go back to the same thing. So there is really this do loop, which means that it's very difficult to really get out of it. And that's another illustration here. If you look at the amount of CO2 that's coming from power generation, back in 1990, let's call it 2 billion tons coming out, and it's going up. Look, at different prices of CO2, very little impact, very little impact. Even at $30, maybe you can slow it down a little bit. And look at some of the initiatives that people are talking about. Look at the Lieberman and Warner initiative here, which is talking about reducing emission by 30% by 2030, 30% below 05 level by 2030. How can you do that? What kind of cost you're going to have to implement in order to get to these kinds of reduction? Huge reductions. $30 can't get you there. And you say, well, What about the recession? Whereas before people were talking about it and said, yeah, there's a cap and trade mechanism, you can do taxes, you can do all sorts of things. But unfortunately now, because of recession, it's very difficult to see increases in the price of electricity as a result of what's going on. So there is going to be delay. What about prices, international cooperation? When are we going to have a recovery? Lots and lots of issues. And we've seen those issues now. We've seen them, in fact, over last week, with the European Union, when they've really made some concessions to countries like to countries like Poland. They had their 20-20-20 by 2020. Clearly, that has been watered down a little bit, and partly because of the recession, partly because countries like Poland, in particular, who rely so heavily on coal, if there is these draconian measures, they called them in Poland, then clearly Poland would move into negative GDP for the next 10 or 15 years. So concessions have had to be made, and that's really what we've seen happening, and maybe that's what we might see also in the future worldwide. In terms of what are we doing about it within GDF-Suez? Well, as a producer of electricity and heat, we use the best technology and constantly improve our performance. We believe in a gas business. We're the largest LNG player in the world. We really would like to see the use of this fuel being more widespread because it will help significantly. We trade electricity, gas, and oil actually around the world and here in the United States, including trading also energy and green certificates. And we have the experience needed if some sort of cap and trade mechanism is going to be implemented nationwide here in the United States. We believe in using technologies and to help. And we advise clients, industrial and commercial clients, in terms of the technologies to use to help reduce emissions. Climate change is a key corporate commitment for us. We do believe in fighting climate change, preserving resources, promoting quality of life, responding to economic signals, and finally being a really local and regional player wherever we are. We're active around the world, so we are active here in the United States. We have 8,000 megawatt of generation in the United States. A lot of that is hydro and gas as well. So we really believe to working with local population and local rules to make sure that we fight climate change. Finally, I want to talk about briefly now climate change legislation. What does it really needs to include? And we believe it must be federal. There is no doubt about that. We also believe that any climate change initiatives need to harmonize state, national, international regulations. Today in the United States, we have various initiatives at state level, at regional level. We truly believe that it really needs to be harmonized for it to work. We also believe that technology will help, and the impact will be lessened if the right technology is being used. Cap and trade is clearly one possibility. We also believe that no nation alone can do it alone, and therefore international cooperation is required. We truly believe that it needs to be flexible because things change, technology changes, etc., and therefore knowledge change, and therefore any initiative, any legislation needs to be flexible and adaptable, and finally economic-wide. In terms of structural objectives, it needs to be mandatory. They need to be annual emission targets. It needs to be integrated into international program. But having said that, even if we are not able to get to a federal legislation immediately, we truly believe that what's going on at the state level, RPS, production tax credit, regional REGI, etc., they are all better than no plans at all. So we do have few things in the United States. We'd like to preserve what we have, but we'd like to go towards a federal initiative. But if we can't get there quickly, let's preserve what we have, tweak what we have, make them better, because eventually we'll get there. Clearly, there need to be clear signals in terms of pricing of CO2. It's only when you have clear signals you can do something about it. And finally, we truly believe that obviously if you have with a tax or cap and trade mechanism, there could be a significant amount of taxes. Some people calculated up to $100 billion a year, maybe more, that could be coming from some sort of cap and trade mechanism. We believe that it needs really to be recycled back into the energy sector, into efficiency, tax credit, technology, etc. And that's the only way to get out of this do loop that I was talking about. And finally, in conclusion, we really need to balance, any legislation needs to balance three things. It needs to balance security of supply, because countries, if they don't have a secure supply, and we are talking about it in the United States, we talk about it in Europe, it needs to be security of supply of fuel as well as technology. That's really important. So you need to balance security of supply. You need also to balance it with cost of fuel and being able to use the right technology. And finally, we need to recognize the impact on the environment. It's only when you get those three things together that any policy is going to work. If you only have one policy that favors one at the expense of the other one, we will have an imbalance, and it is unlikely that it will work, at least work in the long term. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have each of the speakers present their piece first, and then we'll have them all come up the front to answer questions. So our next speaker is Rhonda Zigoki. She's Vice President of Policy, Government and Public Affairs at Chevron. She joined Chevron Canada Resources in Calgary as a petroleum engineer, working primarily in Western Canada. She's held a lot of previous positions in the corporation, including Strategic Business Services, Chief Financial Officer for Chevron Canada Resources, Manager of Strategic Planning, responsibility for overseeing merger integration planning. And something that I picked up on, she was also Managing Director of Chevron Australia in Perth for a while, given I'm from Australia originally. But most relevant to the conference, she's Vice President of Health, Environment and Safety at one stage at Chevron as well. So I'm sure she'll have some very interesting things to say on this issue for us. Thank you very much, Rhonda.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think you'll find some similarities in my discussion with my colleague from GDF Suez as we talk about what business has learned from all of this policy. The focus in the previous discussion was on power. You'll hear a lot from me on fuels. And I'll focus on what we're doing in about 4 or 5 jurisdictions around the world, how we see our role, and kind of the signposts and learnings that we're seeing as policy emerges. Let me just start first by saying that since it began, the Baker Institute has emphasized scholarship that bridges theory with practice. And that's exactly the sort of pragmatic approach that makes Chevron a proud Institute supporter. So let me first say to everyone here, and to Ed and Amy, thanks for your leadership, and congratulations on 15 years, and hopefully many more to come. In typical Baker fashion, this conference couldn't be more relevant. While regions like the EU, Australia, and even our home state of California are out in front on this issue, climate policy in reality is still emerging the world over. And in the context of U.S. policy, and it's been said many times already, President-elect Obama has signaled strongly his intent to make energy central and a priority in his administration, and that includes climate change. To frame that policy, Chevron President-elect has offered a letter concerning recommendations on energy, among them a call to use energy more wisely. We've heard a lot about energy efficiency this morning already, and to expand and diversify America's energy portfolio. Another key element of our recommendations are advocacy as well for a national approach to climate. We also pointed out that climate efforts be informed by economic and technical realities and the work underway around the globe. Chevron shares the concerns of governments on climate change and respects their desire to address this issue. Most people agree it's not a good idea to continue unrestricted hydrocarbon combustion, and we agree. We aim to be a constructive voice in this debate, and through our work around the world, we as others have come to realize the climate issue and associated policies are pretty complex. And since the impact of carbon reduction policies are going to be felt on the economy, we need to get it right. And the imperative to get it right pretty much underscores the history of climate and the environment as we see it. Our thinking on climate change actually emerged and was codified into an action plan that we rolled out in 2001, and it focused on 4 areas at that time: energy efficiency and reduction, physical reduction in our operations, investing in research and development and technology, pursuing innovative business opportunities, and supporting sound and economical and flexible policies. We also contribute technical expertise to a number of public, private, and intergovernmental forums, including the IPCC, with specific expertise in carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas measurement. We're active in markets, including the CDM. And most recently, we've articulated 7 principles for shaping climate policies. And again, you'll see some similarities with the last speaker. And they include, of course, the need for global engagement, and within policy, consideration of energy security, energy efficiency and conservation, a measured and flexible approach, of course, equitable treatment amongst the sectors, technology enablement, and very importantly, transparency. Our views derive from and inform our ongoing work in various policy, legislative, and regulatory aspects of climate in at least 5 jurisdictions: Washington, D.C., California, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Everywhere we have big operations around the world, we're engaged with these governments as they work to shape these policies. So what do we see in these various jurisdictions? And this will be kind of the bulk of my comments, talking about what we've learned. Part of the challenge is the emerging patchwork of policy. It's, however, though, not surprising that this is happening, given each country's unique economic and energy security circumstances, natural resource endowments, and the diversity of views of states and provinces on the issue itself. A made-in-Canada approach, for example, would recognize the national strategic value of the oil sands and look for solutions that would preserve the competitiveness of those exports. We are seeing different schemes emerge between the provinces that include carbon taxes, carbon caps, and carbon intensity goals. Australia's focus is economy-wide, with special attention to their trade-exposed industries and relief for near-term cost impacts on transportation fuels. For the U.S., we are faced with our own patchwork of policies that is now emerging in individual states, and through separate but relevant federal action enacted through the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Within the U.S., we strongly believe harmonization will be needed to avoid duplicative and complex overlay of a national policy. And as climate policy has emerged, so have the lessons learned. As governments have come on board, we're seeing tension between reducing emissions, energy security, preserving domestic economic output, and economic growth. We also are seeing that policy alone does not ensure the intended outcomes if technology, scale, and commerciality are not available. By reaching too far too quick, unintended consequences have quickly become revealed. Take biofuels. They're often mentioned as a big part of future solutions. They are important. We ourselves are undertaking a number of R&D efforts in cellulosic biofuels, but we've quickly learned much about their practical limitations. Scale, for instance. One biofuel plant might produce in a year what a typical refinery will produce in 2 weeks. Achieving the scale intended by the mandates is a significant challenge. Then there are land use, resource use, food versus fuel, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions also emerging. For one reason or another, very recently, we have seen the UK, the EU, and now the US signal adjustments in near-term mandates. So there's significant challenges. There's a myriad of other unknowns: leakage, trade exposure, emissions trajectories, cost containment, all among the issues that the early mover nations are wrestling with. There are a number of important signposts that suggest the early mover nations are moderating their policies in response, even if ever so slightly. Indeed, we are seeing increasing recognition globally about the challenges and risks of including transportation sector under cap-and-trade regimes. Low-carbon fuel solutions are viewed as many as one of the most difficult and expensive of the greenhouse gas mitigation options. Including fuels under a cap doesn't make the job any easier. The ETS excludes the fuels. California and the Western Climate Initiative is deferring the inclusion of fuels under the cap. And Australia plans to actually offset carbon costs through a gas tax reduction in the early years of their scheme. Other signposts in the US and Australia reflect a shift towards greater consideration of slightly back-end loaded emissions trajectories for national cap-and-trade programs, as well as containing costs through offsets and other mechanisms. And we're seeing that the protection of trade-exposed emissions-intensive industries from carbon leakage has become a central policy focus of US, Australia, and Europe. So all of these complexities are finding their way into the policy discussions, and we think that's a good thing. Generally, we're seeing, however, and that despite the global economic crisis, momentum has not waned for greenhouse gas policy, but it is being tempered by more reality where possible, technically, politically, and economically. The policy scale seems to be tipping more and more away from the dogmatic to the pragmatic. This no doubt points to a growing recognition that energy security, the available of affordable, reliable energy, cannot be separated from considerations about climate. Policies must consider them in tandem. Policies geared toward absolutes, economic growth regardless of environmental consequences, or emissions reductions at any cost, are bound to be unsustainable. Prudence argues for moderation and flexibility at the front end to allow appropriate recalibration based on the wisdom of experience. This is what we mean when we suggest a principle like measured and flexible approach. The U.S. will face these issues and more as we learn from work underway in other nations, as well as actions already being taken in the nation. And while there's been some proposed legislation over the past year or so, there's really been no serious debate in Congress as yet on the most cost-effective way forward. Up to now, in fact, policy proposals have typically been overly complex, highly opaque, and disproportionate in their treatment of certain emitting industries, and fail to fully integrate energy security objectives. We think they've also failed to effectively account for and harmonize the actions already taken in the nation. California's AB 32, the RGGI states, and the greenhouse gas contribution from the renewable fuel standard, CAFE, and energy efficiency mandates of the 2007 Energy Bill. Most proposals view cap and trade, and it's been said before, in the broadest sense as the favored approach to tackle climate. There really is no ideal when it comes to climate policy. We've seen some schemes that includes fuels under the cap, some that don't. We've seen a mix of points of regulation with schemes and varying ways to manage leakage and costs. And we see a high degree of inequity between the sectors. The unintended consequences of some of these anticipated solutions have yet to be fully discovered. And it's precisely the consideration of potential consequences, especially given our experience with the EU, and as well as the domestic asset rain program, which we believe suggests a more efficient and measured approach. Let me elaborate briefly. Both of these programs involve caps and trading. Right now, we know how to utilize a cap to reduce emissions from a facility smokestack, point source emissions. Taking a cap and trade scheme from such a narrow sector of the economy and expanding economy-wide, however, is something we far know less about. It's part of the reason why we support a national sectorial-based approach that establishes a cap-and-trade program for facility emissions, which we understand, and a separate regulatory program for transportation sector, which is already now operating under new and challenging mandates. We think this approach could create a workable market for stationary sources and encourage new technology to reduce the carbon content of fuels, and allows the focus on the full implementation in important fuel efficiency standards under the ESHA 2007. It also improves equity between sectors and avoids the duplicative regulation of fuels, which would otherwise be subject to cost and complexity of complying with performance standards as well as cap-and-trade rules. Whatever path the U.S. ultimately takes, the potential impacts of any scheme are going to be great, and consumers also need to be part of the dialogue. They need to understand how these policies will impact them, the real economic costs of mitigating and adapting to climate change. The country will need the electorate on board. As for Chevron, we view our role in this whole debate as helping policymakers ensure that policy is not only equitable across the economy, and of course we're concerned about our sector, but workable technically, practically, and economically. We typically look at government's aspirations and ask 3 questions. Will it work in the real energy delivery system? Is it fair? And is it transparent? So we take those aspirations and develop practical applications to make them work literally at the refinery valves and across the chain. For example, in California, there's AB 32 in the low carbon fuel standard, and we've been at the table with CARB with our technical experts since day one. Since the legislation came with a destination, without a roadmap, it's taken government, business, and NGOs to collaborate on the rules. We also take views on allowance schemes to ensure fairness across sectors and within sectors, promoting such concepts like benchmarking to try to reward early actions. In Australia, we're encouraging the Rudd government to recognize and protect the economic importance and the environmental value of the country's LNG industry, a part of their plan. And I think today they've announced the latest version of their green paper and have accommodated to some extent some of these trade-exposed industries. That's good news. The industry has more to offer as well from our experience. We have over 100 years of experience in managing subsurface reservoirs and more than 3 decades of experience injecting carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. So as an industry, we play a vital role in ensuring CCS technology is developed properly, is deployed, and the policies can make it work. And we have decades of demonstrated performance in one of the most cost-effective greenhouse gas mitigation solutions of all, energy efficiency. We're a strong proponent of saving energy because it's one of the solutions really that sits at that intersection of security, economy, and climate. Energy saved is energy found. We've reduced our energy efficiency 27% since 1992, and we actually have a company dedicated to marketing efficiency to others, saving energy, money, and greenhouse gas for customers across the country. Our role is also to help to understand scale, timeframes, and investment needed. For example, if we were to capture and store all of the emissions from power generation in the U.S., we need an infrastructure as vast and complex as today's network of petroleum pipelines. In one day, we'd have to move the equivalent of 50 million barrels of carbon dioxide around the U.S., and that's twice the volume of crude we move around the country on any given day. Like biofuels, it will take time to achieve meaningful scale. And investments, it's been mentioned before, will be huge. The G8's proposed getting to 50% reductions by the year 2050. The IEA says that's going to take $45 trillion, and it will call for multiple actions across multiple nations, across multiple sectors. Clearly ambitious proposals demands transparency, thorough and ongoing discussion, not just to avoid sticker shock, but actually to ensure capital efficiency. There's high risk of stranded capital in some of these things, and that is something I think the world's economy would like to avoid. So in summary, I'll summarize. We're seeing climate policy continuing to progress. There's no question the motivations have not been tempered in any way by the global economic crisis, but they have been tempered by the economic and technical realities. And these learnings offer invaluable insights into the debate going forward as we shape the right policy for the U.S. The learnings also emulate the Baker model by bringing theory into practice, and your voice will be an important one to keep us centered and on the right track toward the right destination: energy security, reduced greenhouse gas, and a healthy economy. There's a lot at stake for our industry, for the country. We have a lot to offer this debate, and as Chevron, we will stay engaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Our third speaker is Roger Williams, Vice President of Portfolio Development at Blue Source. He runs the company's San Francisco office, where his responsibilities include sourcing and commercializing verified emission reductions from Blue Source's aggregated offset portfolio. His area of expertise includes environmental market design and implementation, environmental finance, and greenhouse gas abatement project development. He also serves as chairman of Carbon Offset Providers Coalition. Prior appointments include World Water Power and Water and Power Corp, Kirill Energy Systems, ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability Cities for Climate Protection Campaign, and Cantor CO2E. Thank you, Roger.
Just give me a sec here. Well, thanks. It's really an honor to be here, and definitely want to thank the organizers, thank Amy and the rest of the staff, and putting this event together. And want to say also that it truly is a great place to have this conference, of course, given the significant contribution and long-standing contribution that this state has had on the energy infrastructure in the U.S., and also the relevance of this topic. So it's definitely a pleasure to be here. About the title, Cat and Mouse, Linking Cap and Trade Programs, I guess I followed a bit of a somewhat long-standing formula of take a climate change acronym, of which there are many, and try to do something marginally clever with it. I don't think I really succeeded in this case, but the thought there is looking at the various systems that are out there right now, again, of which there are many, and how they're playing off each other, some being more aggressive than others. Definitely a history and certain instances of some evasion or going into hiding around this issue. And at this point, we're not certain of the outcome, but it's certainly an interesting time to be engaged. In this presentation, we cover a few topics. A little bit of context on Blue Source. I'm not sure how many of you know about our company, but to help frame this up, because I think we do look different than some of the other speakers here today. And then a perspective on linking and harmonization from our take on things. And then, we're in the trenches developing projects ahead of federal regulations. We've been doing this for a number of years. So I think we do have a voice that hopefully is a bit different than some of the other speakers and what we're seeing in the marketplace today. And then finally, a few thoughts on offsets and accelerating a pre-compliance market. So just two slides about our company. The first one here, as I mentioned, we've been engaged in this business for a long time. Think of us as a project developer aggregator. We completed our first transaction back in 1996. We have project development experience in 20-plus industries and are split up into two primary business units. The first one is the carbon credit portfolio, and this is an aggregated portfolio that is between 100 and 2 million tons. That's kind of a wide range right there, but it's a function of the specs, what sort of methodology and standard you're applying against the projects that we have in our portfolio. Again, over 20 project types, sourced in 48 states and also most of the provinces in Canada. But our geographic scope has been mainly North America to date, which is different than some of the other folks that we compete against in the market. And we've been pioneers in carbon technology and trading development and have developed the first protocols in numerous carbon categories in the US and Canada. The second part of our business is a carbon infrastructure and investment arm. And this has been accelerated greatly over the last 4 months, the announcement of a partnership with Oxif Capital Management. I'll talk about it on the next slide. But we've created a $525 million carbon investment fund to invest in projects that yield high volumes of greenhouse gas reductions, but also have ancillary benefits associated with them. And we have an additional $525 million callable. Our management team has developed and owned and or operated all the anthropogenic CO2 pipelines in North America. I'm going to talk more about that, given CCS is such an important piece of the puzzle domestically and internationally for that matter. And in terms of skills and expertise, we have blended engineering, finance, and transaction skills on staff. We have sold over 10 million tons to date in the voluntary market. So this hasn't been just an instance of build it and wait. We have a lot of experience working with buyers that are interested in engaging in the market today and coming up with transactions that fit their goals. 60-plus projects in the pipeline, and I'll talk a little bit later about our concept of the carbon highway. In terms of the partners, I mentioned a little bit. First Reserve, largest private equity firm focused on the energy sector and one of the oldest. And a few months back, we announced a partnership with Oxif Capital. They've taken a minority interest in Blue Source, and they're one of the largest and most successful multi-strategy asset managers and energy investors worldwide. This is around the Carbon Investment Fund. And then finally, and we think this is interesting moving forward, is this partnership with Goldman Sachs. Where essentially they're going to be the exclusive marketer of tons from our offsets, and being able to look at the leverage their global commodity trading desks, and for buyers that are working with us, we think that's going to be advantageous to be able to tap into Goldman's know-how and horsepower, if you will, as this market continues to mature. Senior management, successful large cap partnerships with Exxon, Bechtel, Williams. You can see the list there. and then fostering a culture of transparency, integrity, and commitment to leaving a legacy. Getting into the topic at hand, thinking about linking, the ideal global cap and trade program sounds great. A lot of people are spending a lot of time trying to pull this together. The reality that we're seeing today that has been touched on already in prior presentations, we have a disparate and diverse systems right now. Looking at Kyoto Protocol via CDM, joint implementation, the complexities within those programs, and as they're being put under a very close lens right now, looking at post-2012 and what the landscape will look like. And then, of course, the EU ETS, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and really the precedent-setting nature of what the EU has been able to do. And then here in the U.S., where we have now this plethora of state and voluntary programs that have emerged, and how are these all going to shake out and play off each other, and of course the emerging federal program. And just looking at the bills out there, I mean, I know the first half of last year with our Carbon Offset Provider Coalition, we just spent a lot of time looking at Lieberman Warner as it became, as I was mentioning earlier to one of the participants here, a bit of an unwieldy beast, and now turning towards Dingle and Boucher and what that looks like. And then as we move into now the first phase of the Obama administration, how much of that is going to remain and how much is going to change, and all these different pieces playing off each other. Couple just statements about the benefits of linkage. I think these are pretty clear. The whole idea of achieving cost savings if marginal costs of emission reductions vary across the tradable permit system. So this whole idea of achieving a price convergence. And then the second point, that larger, more liquid markets can reduce transaction costs, reducing concerns about market power and reduce total price volatility. I mean, we see this firsthand as we're developing projects. We'll be approached by, you name it, someone who thinks they have a great project that technically does reduce greenhouse gases. And so many of them, even though we like that project, will have to say, you know what? The costs associated, the transaction costs with bringing that project to market at this stage of the game is just too high. We can't take on this project right now. We're hoping to as the markets become more liquid. But for right now, there's a lot that it's tending towards these large volume projects that have more established track records in terms of the methodologies and protocols associated with them. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So what are we looking at? It's this dotted policy landscape. You see at the top there, Obama, a question mark in terms of what really is going to happen during his administration. Exclamation point, because his initial statements have been pretty positive, the fact that cap and trade and climate legislation seems to be a top agenda item. But we'll see. And then all the other programs, but also voluntary programs and state initiatives that create this soup, if you will, of all relating to reducing our greenhouse gases, but all playing off each other in different ways. And it becomes a pretty complex landscape pretty quickly. So, one, the dots are multiplying. There are new programs that are popping up all the time. And it's probably prudent to acknowledge that connecting all these dots is likely infeasible in the short term, but instead, can we pursue harmonization? Can each level of government then do what it can do best? And programs that facilitate, and this is a really important point, facilitate a carbon price signal, whatever form that takes, to be able to show, to internalize that externality and say, okay, there is a price associated with that emission of CO2 or whatever the greenhouse gas is. And within that, the subset of having the broadest possible convergence, coverage, so that it's not just a small subset, but that it covers the full spectrum, and of greatest possible long-term predictability, which is something that I know as a project developer, we face that head on, and seeing what is the landscape going to look like in 5 years, and how does that affect investment, and also willingness on the parts of site owners to take the chance and place a bet on what the political landscape is going to look like in a few years. Again, in terms of harmonization, at each step of the way, what lessons can we learn and what works and what doesn't? And on that point, the U.S. is in a really enviable position in many ways, in that we've got a lot we can draw on right now. Experience in what's happened in the EU system, looking at what's happened so far in some of the regional programs in the U.S., even though they're relatively new, and other programs along the way. So that's part of the hope, I guess, in terms of what happens at the federal level, is that there's a lot to draw upon. and then the point that markets will find a way. That's part of the history and the function of how markets develop and mature if the right signals and indicators are set up. And then finally, this idea of a Made in America approach, which I think is something we might see. The idea that we're going to probably have our own take and insert, I think, some project types and the whole spectrum of sequestration. Looking at terrestrial sequestration, looking at CCS. I think we've seen this already in the draft legislation at the federal level. Just as one example, that we'll probably take pieces of what's happened in the past, but definitely have our own brand on what comes out the other side. Looking within the U.S. and this idea of harmonizing state and federal systems, there's a huge opportunity here. The regional programs, looking at what's happening in California, the RGGI program, WCI is a regional program. These are models that the federal program can build upon, which I was just mentioning. But hopefully in these instances that there's not going to be a penalty for early action and engagement, which is something that we're actively advocating for. And under the potential for complications under these programs, there is a diverse offset policies. We're seeing this too much, where the number of project types, the crediting period for the offset program, the size of the offset pool, all of that it's a bit of a moving target, and it looks different, and it adds complexity. Now, for a project developer, that can be a benefit in that we help navigate through that and find the best value for an emission reduction in the marketplace, given these different regional programs. But it also leads to confusion and arguably stifles the acceleration that needs to take place on this issue. And then the interaction with renewable energy credit programs, how's that going to shake out? Looking at, this has already been talked about, the rise of RPS standards throughout the United States. And we're seeing that with renewable energy credit marketers. They're all establishing an offset, verified emission reduction carbon component to their business. They're seeing that a federal climate change legislation is going to have some effect and potentially will absorb some of that momentum, if you will, from the REC trading market. And how that's going to play out in the end, we're not sure yet, but people are starting to prepare for that and hedge against that. The concept of leakage, and we're seeing this in the state where I come from, in California. The last point there, the designs to address leakage. In California, as you're looking at most of the generation coming from outside of the state, well, how do you plan and come up with a system that can address that? Well, when you're talking about, in California, the case of inclusion of load-serving entities versus generators, at a national context, that doesn't necessarily translate very well. This is one of the challenges when you're trying to get out in front, but yet have an eye on what's going to happen at the federal level. That's one of the challenges. Which gets to the last point on this slide, is this overall question of timing and relevance. And I know that we've seen this a lot over the course of this past year and even prior. What's going to be the relevance of AB 32 in California with respect to WCI, and vice versa? Which one's influencing the other? The idea, again, of the cat and mouse. Who's chasing who here? And then on the federal level, is all of that going to be usurped quicker than we think? And these are all pieces we're trying to decide where it makes sense and what the relevance of these different programs would be. And I mention that because in the context of a company that's trying to manage their greenhouse gases, that becomes a fairly confusing landscape of what am I planning around, and what is the regulatory environment going to look like for me in 5 or 10 years. And so that's part of what we do on a day-to-day basis, and spend a lot of time staying on top of that, on what we're seeing and the directions where we think things are headed. Looking outside the U.S., there's a lot of great lessons that can be learned from what's happened in the EU ETS system. I'll take a couple slides and talk through a few of those. First, and I definitely want to emphasize this point, what a remarkable achievement. Up and running in 18 months, dwarfs the acid rain program, multi-billion-dollar market. So there's so huge accolades there in getting out in front and designing a program that's up and running. Now, difficulties identified in the pilot phase. And these are some of the criticism, if you will, that has been levied against the EU ETS. Only partial coverage of greenhouse gas emissions, concerns about allocation-related windfalls, failure to generate substantial reductions in price volatility. Just going to have a couple points on each of these. In terms of addressing the partial coverage issue, the idea of heading to an economy-wide cap-and-trade design, and we're seeing that in some of the federal bills. Both Lieberman Warner and Dingell-Boucher have had an emphasis on this upstream approach and automaker regulation. And then the coverage of non-CO2 greenhouse gases as well. On the point about concerns about allocation-related windfalls, the idea of linking allocation to entities affected by the regulation, even if not themselves regulated, I think is something we're going to see in the final derivation of our federal legislation. And then a phase out of allocations over time is something that's probably likely as well. And it's addressing the failure to generate substantial reductions, increasing the regulatory certainty, providing a long-term path of emissions targets. This is something that has been talked about, looking at CDM, for example, of what is the post-2012 reality for CDM. Is there going to be this cliff, this drop-off? Is there going to be a continuity there? We've seen that from market participants who we compete against, where there's been a bit of an attrition for various reasons, but part of it is the market uncertainty, what's going to happen post-2012, which makes it hard to do long-term planning and to really accelerate around what needs to happen. And then establishing a focused long-term technology program. I'm convinced we're going to see that in our federal program, using allowance allocations to generate revenues for it. I think we've seen some hints of that in what Obama has talked about on the campaign trail, but we'll see in his first few months in office. And then under addressing allowance price volatility, providing broader trading opportunities, which I guess is the topic at hand, looking at harmonization and linkage. That, as mentioned in an earlier slide, is going to be a road towards reducing costs, but also providing some price stability. And then and also providing a safety valve price cap and/or robust use of offsets as a cost containment mechanism. And I think there's going to be a closer eye on this, given the realities of actually executing on a nationwide and indeed global cap and trade program. And we start to really delve into in a finer tooth comb the costs associated with what we're undertaking with respect to the economic conditions globally right now. So what if the U.S. program varies from EU ETS? It could preclude a direct connection with the EU ETS or other Kyoto programs, but there's all sorts of benefits nonetheless. The enactment of a U.S. program might be impossible without a different design, given that some of the issues that we're going to see here, I think, might be distinct or at least play more of a role than we've seen internationally. I think CCS might be an example, at least from this, looking historically, how that has been treated. And a standalone U.S. program could achieve substantial reductions. I think that's just a fact. And then the enactment of some kind of U.S. program could facilitate establishment of an international regime. So just the influence of basically the U.S. moving from absolute inaction to becoming active, even if we basically do our own thing. And even a disconnected U.S. program could help sustain confidence in EU ETS, showing just momentum as the U.S. starts to move on this. And then finally, through arbitrage, markets can harmonize divergent programs, so there is an opportunity, even if there's not a direct linking, for nonetheless some harmonization to take place. So turning now just a little bit to what we're seeing then as we're out there day to day and talking to companies and saying, we can help you given if we're going to come in and co-finance with you and develop a project and bring to market, or if it's a project that's already been developed and you're looking to it for a path to market. What's that conversation like? And we see this only too much, a wait-and-see mentality, wondering, again, what is that regulatory landscape really going to look like? And you know what? I'm not going to do anything right now. And that's something that we would love to see changed, not only for our business, but just for what needs to happen right now. Move beyond the ambiguity, as mentioned in the second bullet point. Stifling acceleration. We're just seeing it too often where people end up sitting on the fence because they're not sure what that outcome's going to be, and that's something that we are actively engaged in how to mitigate some of those risks and to reward participants who get into the market early. But hands down, political risk is a top consideration as we're assessing different projects. All the different metrics and the alchemy of what makes a project viable from a carbon market perspective, right at the top of the list, again, is gauging that political risk, which for us translates into, again, being as engaged as we can, both in Sacramento and DC, on where things are headed on behalf of suppliers that we're working with. And so for us, in practice, we structure deals to provide that flexibility depending on the regulatory outcomes. So for example, if an entity is not sure if it's going to be regulated or unregulated, let's say it ends up being regulated and saying, I'm going to have a compliance commitment that I need to hit. Why should I head out in the market today and develop a project and sell those reductions? I may need those at a later date. So structuring deals with those entities where it provides that sort of flexibility, there'll be that option, and yet to be able to drive value for ourselves and helping to move the ball forward and not being stuck in a wait and see mentality. So what does this all amount to? We're seeing all the indications domestically, internationally, that this carbon reduction juggernaut is underway. I think we've turned the corner. We've reached the tipping point, whatever little phrase you want to put in there. And I decided to put kind of a strange graphic in there, which was off of Wikipedia, when I was wondering, well, how's juggernaut depicted? And I actually spoke to a couple colleagues when I was going to pass this presentation around. They said, that's kind of a weird one. I don't know if you should go with that. And then as I took a closer look, I said, well, okay, this is from like the 1850s, this description of a juggernaut. And I said, well, it's big. You're not sure what it is. It's coming at you. That sounds like the carbon market to me, so I'm going to leave it in there. So this getting close to the end of my presentation here, a perspective on the use of offsets. We're heavily engaged, obviously, in this area. I think we have thought a lot about this in just a couple of perspectives, and I think some of this is, this is not groundbreaking, but I think there is some punctuating that merits a few words. First, offsets, if appropriately qualified, will reduce costs. This idea of focusing on the standards, don't artificially hem in have an apprehensive view about offsets around the quality of offsets, and thereby limiting the quantity or the geographic boundaries around those projects. Instead, focus on the standards themselves. And there's a lot to draw upon right now. And so that's where we think the emphasis should be placed, and we're seeing that on these quantitative limits in various bills where we think that that's not necessarily the best place for them. The second point tied to that, looking at just from a cost perspective, according to EPA, full use of offsets will reduce costs of a cap-and-trade program by 85%. Not allowing offsets increases costs over roughly $650 billion. We're seeing in Dingell-Boucher a 5% use of offsets, at least initially. We think that's too low. And again, focus on the standards themselves. And finally, on this slide, demand additionality, but use a performance-based standard that's not binary. And what I mean by that is this idea of having, once you reach X percent in the market, then you say, okay, this is business as usual. Let's say that's 60%. Well, what about the other 40%? They've just suddenly lost the incentive to move forward. Our idea, something that we're advocating, we're not the only ones, is to discount the value of reduction as the rate of technology is adopted to create continued incentive up to 100%. This is something that's taking place in Canada in the Alberta program. We think it's really smart. So there's not this sudden binary aspect where a project then loses the incentives. Let's take it to 100%. And here, just this idea of early action, but I feel like those two words, they start to have such a negative connotation with them in some policy circles. Framing it more as incentivizing emission reductions 6 years earlier. If you look at currently the way Dingell-Boucher is written, having a clear start date. Again, if you look at all the science, or the vast majority of the science, we have no time to wait here. And in some of the federal legislation, and in Dingell-Boucher we're seeing this, that there's enough that's kicked out to the administrator that really a project developer or an entity that might want to take action will say, you know what, I don't have to do this up until 2012 or 2014 once I know exactly what the rules are. we need to get started today. So let's have start dates, and we're suggesting 2006, with then a crediting period that's January 1st of 2008. So projects and innovation are not stifled by the start date and crediting period ambiguity. Don't wait. Let's establish that. Let's set that now. And the crediting period duration, this is more from a project finance perspective. We think that 5 years is too short. There's precedence to be more towards 10 years, which we think is a better spot in terms of getting more projects completed. And finally, creating that positive list, not wondering what project types are going to be included and which ones are not. Include the positive list as early as possible for select project types and methodologies. Again, there's a lot to draw upon. Domestically, internationally, there's been a lot of thinking done on this. There isn't, even though I mentioned this Made in America approach, hopefully that doesn't mean EPA starting completely from scratch. And from our perspective, it really should be, let's have the indications early, let's have them now so market participants can start and not get burned by acting early. And that's something that we're heavily advocating for in the policy circles where we're navigating in. A couple last slides. I think this is relevant, especially here in Texas, the acceleration of CCS deployment through enhanced oil recovery. This has been touched on in prior presentations. It's going to be a big part of the picture, we believe, in the United States, whether it's an offset or allowance. Nonetheless, it's going to be a big part of the picture. 85 billion barrels of stranded domestic onshore oil will only be produced through EOR. This is a result of the DOE NETL study. Also, NRDC has recently and quite vocally have been speaking about this, which is really interesting. This is equal to 18 times the oil in ANWR. The environmental benefit is unequivocal when displacing imported oil. And there are hundreds of high-purity anthropogenic CO2 sources now venting that could be captured today. And that's something that we're very active in. You're saying, where are the large vent stack sources? How can we address those today? And how can the carbon market help get these projects off the ground? And tied to that, oil revenues will help fund the billions of dollars required to build the first phase of national CO2 pipeline infrastructure. We have roughly 3,500 miles of CO2 infrastructure now. Build it out to 15,000. And do that on the back of oil revenues from enhanced oil recovery. That's part of our vision. And when people talk about CCS, they talk about clean coal, this acknowledgement that coal is going to be here, not only in the U.S., but definitely in China and so many other countries, Poland, et cetera. The acknowledgement that it is going to be here, let's be as clean as we can in how we utilize coal. But in order to drive that cost per ton down, we need to have that infrastructure in place. So that's what we're talking about, is building that domestic infrastructure. And CCS EOR is a bridge to help get to that CCS for coal power plants, which today the price is way too high. So it's kind of simple economics, and with CCS EOR being a contributor in getting there. And then with that, that also paves the way for other geologic storage formations like aquifers, that will follow if these key conditions are achieved. And so with that, pretty graphic, but our vision of the carbon highway is coming, saying there is going to be a large infrastructure and moving CO2 around that is going to be tied to the carbon market. And we think it should be, to accelerate that adoption and accelerate that infrastructure that we think is critical towards the solution in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. as well. Last slide here is just a repeat of one prior, again, looking at the idea of focusing on harmonization, and under that second point, just I wanted to point out one more time, is that the various programs should facilitate a carbon price signal. I think that's the big thing, and that it's of broadest possible coverage, of greatest possible long-term predictability, and with that, you're going to start to see the increased momentum that we need to have take place. I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our three speakers for keeping to time. I'd like to ask them also to come up to the front, please, and answer any questions you might have. Maybe the first thing I would do is invite any of the speakers, if they have any question of any of the other speakers. Please give you first chance. Anyone would like to ask anything about any other speakers? No? Okay, so in which case I'll open up to the floor. Yes? Could you say who you question?
Well, Mr. Williams, how would the adoption of a carbon tax instead of cap and trade affect your business?
Great question. Our business is built on cap and trade, definitely. And in terms of our business, it would greatly affect our business. I guess getting back to the, if you just think about the different those different policy possibilities, from our perspective on, I'll just leave one thought, which is one of the main ones, which didn't come up before in the idea of a carbon tax as potentially a more advantageous route. And there are plenty of arguments in that direction. One that wasn't mentioned that people point to, which I think is quite valid, that against the carbon tax is the idea that with the carbon tax, how the revenues you're going to be in, but not necessarily the environmental benefit that's going to be achieved by that tax. With the cap and trade program, it is pegged to the emissions themselves. So this whole idea of what do you do with those tax dollars? Are those going to be effectively allocated to reach those parts per million in the atmosphere? And is that going to be the best approach? There's a huge question mark there. And that's one of the I think the primary arguments, which I like around cap and trade, is saying let's look at the numbers, let's look at the total tons that can be emitted and back out from there, and then we'll have prices reward the smartest players in the market to achieve the lowest cost reductions, with all the other pieces in there around offsets and all the other pieces. But with respect to cap and trade, I think that's a central point and distinction between the carbon tax and cap and trade.
More questions?
Mr. Smati, I didn't see all of the presentation because I was watching it on the monitor outside, but you indicated that at a $30 a ton carbon tax, that it really didn't change the dispatch order of coal and natural gas. Did you actually have your guys do the analysis at what level the carbon tax or effective carbon tax would be, at which point coal starts to drop off of the dispatch order?
Yeah. Essentially what I was saying is that if you have a carbon tax or some sort of a tax or cost to carbon, which is $30, then what you do, $30 a ton of CO2, it will really increase your electricity price from coal-fired generation by $30, but the gas-fired generation will increase by $12. And so really what you see is you are then at the edge. It really tilts when you go to about $35 or $40. So that's when you start seeing this curve which changes in a static way, all things being equal. So if really all you're doing is you assume that the price of gas will not change, then at $35 to $40 you start changing the merit order a little bit, and therefore gas will be generating more. So gas moves from mid-merit to a base load, and coal starts moving more towards the mid-merit. However, that's not how it's going to end, because it's all dynamic. As there is a need for more and more gas-fired generation, gas prices, what happens to gas prices? They go up. If they go up, then what happens is that gas starts moving back up and coal moving down. And so you have this circle that I was talking about, which is unfortunately the way it's going to be. So really it's very difficult to predict at what price gas will stabilize, but that's what you're going to end up with. So over $35 to $40, if everything is static, then you would move or swap the merit order. Gas will move down and coal will move up.
Yeah, this is a question both to Ms. Zigoke and Mr. Williams. First, you said that Chevron has a lot of experience in CCS technology. Have you done analysis as to what it will cost, or is it feasible to capture all the carbon dioxide emitted by the coal power plant, and can it be done? And then to Mr. Williams, you said that carbon highways. If it is going to be so profitable, why can't oil companies start doing it themselves without any carbon capture, carbon tax or trade-in capture today itself? Why won't they get all those carbon dioxide and start producing this 80 billion barrels? Or is it dependent upon oil prices, or today's oil prices are not enough? Can you answer that? But first is Does the oil company has the technology today to do all this work?
I would say, first of all, we have not estimated the cost to sequester the total emissions from the coal industry, so I wouldn't be able to give you a number on that. We are a participant in a number of research projects and demonstration projects to look at solutions to reduce cost for capture. I mean, it's the capture technology where the issues are, the front end, getting the pure stream, getting it from atmospheric into a way you can sequester it. So I would say that commercial technologies do not exist today. We do not have a commercial scale plant that exists for a coal-fired plant in existence. So a lot of work needs to be done for those breakthroughs. And the costs range. They can vary, anywhere from 50 to over 100 per ton or so, depending on the configuration of the plants. So it's not an exact answer.
So we are a long way off from finding it out in terms of developing a technology to do this.
I think we can. The technology exists. It's not commercial until you get very high carbon prices. So you'd have to get the market up fairly high too. And of course, they are very expensive propositions. So you'd have to get the carbon price signal and in a sustained way for the willingness to invest at those levels.
Yeah, in response to your question, the fact that we don't have this infrastructure in place is kind of the answer right there, that it is too costly right now. What we're seeing is that, again, getting to the point of carbon capture and storage for clean coal, you're talking, people have various estimates, $50, $60, $80 per ton. And then you talk about sequestration in other geologic formations instead of enhanced oil recovery that doesn't have any other revenue stream associated with it. How are we going to get there? And that's part of what we're talking about, is accelerating that infrastructure piece. So it's not there today. There is the idea of incentivizing an entity instead of pulling from natural sources underground. Why don't you go a little bit further, let's say as an example, to a vent stack source that's going to cost you a little bit more to clean it up, but have the carbon market help shore up that additional cost, so you're not pulling from under the ground, but let's take some of that anthropogenic vent stack CO2 that's just heading into the atmosphere today because there's not regulations around it. And that's kind of what we're getting at here. And heading towards helping CCS for clean coal to become a reality if you believe that coal will be part of our future.
Mr. Smati, you talked about the fact that your presentation is mostly about the electric power industry. Ms. Zagaki said that yours is mostly about fuels, but you didn't talk about kind of where the two might intersect. For example, if we had some type of electrification of our transport infrastructure through plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells, or whatever. So I have two questions. One is, what kind of carbon regulation type of policies would actually encourage kind of the infrastructures to come together in the form of some type of transport electrification? And then the second question, and related to that for you, Ms. Zagaki, about what incentive would Chevron have to promote those types of policies, since it would reduce demand for a product that you produce, gasoline?
Well, I think that the policies to look at, I think the most important thing is actually that how do you reduce emissions from the transportation sector? And you have really three options. You have the fuel itself, the vehicle, or vehicles miles traveled. So policies that would actually reduce the kind of driver behavior. I think all of those in amongst themselves provide the combination to advance technology in hybrid electric vehicles or electric vehicle technology or the electrification of transportation. And when carbon prices get to a certain extent, those things will be triggered. I mean, there's also incentives in technology that the government talks about to promote those things as well. But I think just the carbon policy alone that caps emissions will work their way towards continuous progress in the transportation sector amongst those three areas to take emissions down. I think the most important thing is that you take emissions down and not pick the winners and losers as to what the solution is. So it'll be a combination of those three things.
I think what I would like to say before we even talk about emissions, if we have electric vehicles, that means demand for electricity is going to go up. And therefore, how are you going to meet that demand? There isn't just one solution. It's not just saying, okay, renewable is the answer. I think you're going to have, especially in the United States, where, as I said to you earlier, we have 1,000 gigawatt of capacity right now. So you really are going to need all technologies. You're going to need a lot of nuclear, you're going to need renewable, you're going to need gas, and maybe you would need also coal and some clean coal technology as well. It means that you're going to have massive, massive investments. If you say, you know what, it's easy, maybe let's just replace all the coal-fired generation we have in the United States by nuclear. Well, let me just remind you that we have 300 gigawatt of coal-fired generation. If you were to replace it by nuclear, i.e. building a new 300 gigawatt of generation which is from nuclear, the cost is going to be well over $1 trillion. So the cost is huge. Therefore, the solution is by having different technologies, everything will be needed. In addition to that, yes, the environment will play a significant part in that, and therefore at some point in the future we're going to have some sort of federal legislation, which means whether it's cap and trade mechanism or some sort of tax which will really price carbon correctly. At the end of the day, you need to have transparency, you have to have signals in the market, and I think the market will take care of that. But right now the solution is probably to develop all technologies, to have all the technologies ready to meet the needs of the infrastructure of tomorrow.
Yeah, I have a question about sort of the process of these markets harmonizing. So say I'm a multinational corporation and the ETS is not auctioned all of its permits, so maybe the first stage problem with the ETS is they gave away too many permits for free. Now I'm going to start a new system in the United States. Let's say I auction all the permits, and so I would have a much more, theoretically, I should have a much more expensive market. Now what happens to those markets? Does that mean that everybody who got something for free in Europe now is going to have some huge benefit from these very high prices in the United States, but everybody in the United States who didn't get a free permit in that same industry, is no longer competitive compared to European players? I'd like the panel to kind of address that a little bit. Whoever wants to take it on.
Yeah, I mean that gets to definitely the idea of leveling the playing field. So you don't have these big disparities and talk about, well, link them together and away you go, because there is going to be then winners and losers under those systems, and the bigger difference between the programs, and to the extent that they are linked and different, the wider the gap between the winners and losers, if you will. And so, I think your example is spot on, and that's something that now everyone's taking a very close look at. And fortunately, we're in this this malleable phase for carbon markets, where heading into Copenhagen, new administration, there's an opportunity to really do some syncing up here. But if there is a great disparity between, for example, free allocation or auctioning, then there will be some winners on one side of the Atlantic or the other, or maybe some on both. But that is part of the challenge, is making sure there's not too big of a disparity there. And fortunately, there is a window right now to really delve into that. So I don't mean to be too slippery on it, but I think you're right that there is that's part of the apprehension.
No, I agree. That's why we said, initially that whatever legislation we're going to have in the United States, it needs to be really harmonized and synchronized with the rest of the world. because we, as a company, we operate obviously in Europe and in the United States, but we frankly operate completely separately. So what we do in Europe is very different from what we do in the United States, because legislation is so different, rules are so different, so you can't have one way of dealing both with Europe and the United States and the rest of the world for that matter. So right now we are not able to do it, we can't do it, and we won't do it. However, if we have a policy which starts to be a little bit more harmonized, a little bit more synchronized, then you can actually do it. But for the time being, it's very difficult to do.
I don't think I can offer much more. I think the debate on that issue is very immature because of the patchwork we're seeing, and not everyone's at that point. There's still a lot of work on national policy, let alone how to link them if they were even in place. Most of the work we've been doing in terms of harmonization really is just on the allowability of CER, certified emissions reductants from CDM and other programs, to be used across borders, and I think that is, pretty much an accepted platform or policy right now.
Well, what about, I don't know if anybody in the panel has experience with this new Reggie market in New England. Has that created some problems that, like I'm talking about, in terms of I'm going to trade in both markets?
Both markets being where? I'm
going to trade in the New England market, and I'm also trading in the ETFs.
I don't think there is any problem there, because it's really related. If you look at the Reggie market, it's related to 10 essentially states in the Northeast. So you really are trading there. And the cost, if you look at the cost of the first auction, was around $3. Second auction, which is coming up, is 17th. I guess it's in 2 days. It looks as if prices will be around $4. So it's a significant difference compared to the ETS market, where cost went up to $30. So we are a player there. We have power generation there, and we do trade there, and therefore it's a complete disconnect between Europe today, between Europe and the United States, and you can't take one to the other region, one region to another region. They're completely different.
Just a question maybe for anybody on the panel, which is, it seems the average citizen, at least in the United States, is under the impression that this isn't going to hurt a bit. This isn't going to cost a thing. And we have kind of vague descriptions of miracle technologies that will solve the problem, all of which have been around for decades at this point. What kind of message are you taking to your customers, for example, on what the impact of this will be? And do you think that the average citizen will actually be brought along on the policy that would be required to get actual material reduction?
I think this is a very, very, very good question indeed. That's why I was trying to talk also about the energy side, and I was trying to highlight that there is a need for new generation. Forget about emissions just for a few seconds. Just new generation is needed. And the cost of electricity today in most markets which are competitive, or in fact all over the United States, really does not reflect the cost of new build. We've seen a significant increase in the cost of everything. Of course, now the recession might bring some prices down or some costs down, but we've seen an increase over 100% of the cost of steel. As a result of that, if you look at the cost of building new power plant in the United States between 2000 and today, that cost has doubled. And that cost is not reflected today in the price of electricity. So the first thing that will hit consumers is the fact, well, okay, if I'm going to build a new power plant, regardless of what technology it is, price of electricity has got to go up. And consumers tend not to be very happy with that, especially because they think of electricity as something that they can control. It's close by, it's regulated by local regulators. Therefore they blame the local politicians for this increase in price of electricity. So that's a problem. I think the second problem then, if on the top of that you're going to layer a cost of emissions, which could be huge, as we've said in here, that will be even more drastic for most consumers, which will be even more acceptable. I'm moving to a slightly also related subject, which is consumers say, yes, I really want green energy. Please, I want you to sell it to me. We sell green energy. We sell it to large commercial industrial customers. People talk about it. They want it. They need it, etc. But when you show them the price difference between green energy and conventional energy, then most consumers would say, I really want now conventional energy because the price is so huge. And that's the real issue. I think there is some leadership from some large industrial customers, from some large commercial customers in terms of trying to be more green, etc., and buying this green energy. But by and large, 70% of the population, or maybe more, are not willing to pay this significant increase in price. And that's the real issue.
More questions?
Yeah, Roger, one of the things that seems key in any market is mass and size. Part of the thing that I think has helped the EU ETS succeed is even though it's had some of its difficulties, is the size of it. Have there been any efforts to try to utilize an institution like NAFTA to create a creditable environmental stand throughout North America and use the size of that market?
Well, that's a good question and comment. Yeah, on the scale of NAFTA, I've been hearing some rumblings about that. I mean, I know in the state, in California where I live, there has, at the governor's meeting and about a month ago, there was part of that was a statement around actually kind of linking with Mexico, if you will, or utilizing opportunities to reduce emissions in Mexico towards California's compliance and incorporating that into the program. Has a bit of a NAFTA flavor, I guess. But in terms of the broader piece, I think that argument is a sound one, and not only looking to the South, but definitely in Canada and opportunities to work closely with Canada. Also from a policy perspective, I think they've been doing some interesting things there, and there's a lot that we can learn from. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we do see that kind of a bit of an acceleration on that regional mindset, if you will, or at least getting smart about it, partly for the reason that you mentioned, that economy of scale, if you will. But hopefully that it doesn't get stuck there and it translates into some real global cooperation. That's what everyone's driving towards in Copenhagen. So.
Okay, I'm going to... Oh, one more question.
Just a quick question, since we have somebody who deals with Europe and the US. What's the real cost of energy difference between the European, as a consumer, and a US consumer?
Did you say LNG?
Energy in general.
Energy.
Yes.
Energy.
I mean, it's very different because it is true when we go as US citizens go to Europe, the cost of energy is very high there. But is that only because of taxes, or is that?
Well, I mean, it depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about gasoline, for example, and that's really what we see when we go to Europe, and the cost is obviously much higher than here, and arguably, obviously, the main thing is taxation, which is very different in Europe versus here. So that's in terms of gasoline. Obviously, crude oil is the same everywhere. Gas prices, especially LNG, liquefied natural gas, it's a little different. We tend to have a market which LNG, although it's trying to be global, but it's not quite. Most of the contracts that they have in Europe tend to be linked to oil. So when oil prices are very high, they have very high prices. When oil prices are low, therefore it's lower prices. Here in the United States, it's kind of a market here. It's NYMEX, and therefore if you look at today, you pay around $6 per MMBTU for natural gas here in the United States. The price in Europe for LNG is around $8, $9. Then electricity. Electricity is very different. It varies, even within Europe, it varies from country to country. And even here in the United States, we don't have the same price. In New England, it's a little bit higher than what we pay in ERCOT, etc. That's very much a local price, which depends on, for example, in some states in the Midwest, they pay a little bit less because they have coal, and most of the generation is from coal. If you import gas, you pay a little bit more, etc. So it depends on what is at the margin and that what generates electricity. So electricity is very different from state to state and from country to country.
So you're saying that it's not a huge difference?
Well, there is some difference. It really depends. I mean, as I was telling you, even here in the United States, there is quite a big difference between price that you would pay here in Texas versus what some people are paying in the Midwest. In Texas, a lot of what is generated here is from gas. In the Midwest, is from coal. Coal prices are quite a lot less than gas, at least until recently anyway. And so that tends to tilt the balance the other way.
Any more questions? I'm going to have one comment. So getting back to the first question that was asked, since it also, I had sort of mentioned the idea of taxes versus permits. I mean, the point I'd make is that that's precisely what that little diagram I put up was trying to capture, of course, that with permits, if the level of the permit is wrong, you make a mistake. I think that's your point. But the cost of that mistake depends on how sensitive damages are to the quantity of emissions. Right. On the other side, though, if you have a fixed quantity permits, and you make a mistake, in terms of the marginal cost of control, that's one thing that leads to the price volatility problem you talked about. So if the marginal costs of control are very sensitive to the quantity of emissions, if you make a mistake, those prices will move a lot, the price of the CO2. So that extreme price volatility, is related to the slope of the marginal cost curve that I was talking about. So it's precisely because we think that the marginal cost of control is much steeper, so the price volatility can be very large. Why a lot of environmental economists have kind of favoured the tax. So that the mistake on the damages side is less significant than the mistake on the cost side, and it's a difference between CO2 and SO2. So it's one reason why the same people can be very supportive of SO2 permits as a way of controlling SO2 emissions, but be very critical of quantitative limits as a way of controlling CO2. So I agree that you can make a mistake, but the point is how costly is the mistake, and the relative cost of having a wrong tax versus a wrong quantity depends on the slopes of those two curves.
I guess and which always comes up too is just the political palatability of either too, right? That's just the full context, right? Because with a carbon tax, that if you don't get it right, you have to come back and adjust that tax, which the reality of that is difficult, right? So there's these complex policy questions, but thanks for clarifying that.
And one other comment I was going to make, if I can, sort of perhaps abusing my privilege here as the chair of the session, but again, Mr. Williams made a comment about, and I guess it goes back to Amy's point, that arbitrage can harmonise markets. So if we have different markets, sometimes people being able to arbitrage those differences can somehow alleviate the problems. That can be true, but it need not be true. So, we know that, for example, when it comes to foreign exchange rates, so if governments are trying to maintain exchange rates that are not really an equilibrium level, that actually speculation can be very destabilising. Okay, so part of the issue here, I think, with respect to these kind of rules, is that the rules are not credible and sustainable in the long run, or people don't believe they are, then that will drive a lot of speculation against the policy and could be very destabilising. So it need not. I think it depends on the context whether it's whether these are going to be stabilise or destabilise situation.
Peter, can I slightly differ with the statement that you made in the beginning? Like you said, in the case of sulfur dioxide, there were far more different ways and costs of doing it, whereas it is less in the case of carbon dioxide. Yes. I feel it is just the opposite. Just based on what the three speakers have said, there are so many different ways, and we still do not know what different ways are there to reduce carbon dioxide. So that being the case, I would have thought that this cap and trade will be better for this than taxing. So just the opposite, I come to the conclusion just the opposite of what you try to conclude.
Yeah, well, I think the point here is that carbon dioxide is much more pervasively across the economy, connected to many more activities. So if you're really going to try to control it across the board. So I agree if you were to put it on some sectors only, that, because of the leakage problem, if you like, or some of these, another way of putting that, you may be able to reduce it at lower cost. But if you really are going to control the output, the point is that the CO2 is linked to fossil fuel combustion, which is intimately linked to economic activity. So if you're really going to control the amount of CO2, you have to control basically the burning of fossil fuel. And once you start to really alter the amount of energy consumption in the economy, that has very high marginal costs. That's really the point.
You can change the way the energy consumption is allocated in the economy. Yes. For example, electric generation is much more amenable to other sources than fossil fuel burning for electric generation. Mm-hmm. While for transportation, there's really no alternative to fossil fuel burning. you may have electric cars, but are you going to have electric trucks? Are you going to have electric locomotives going across the vast American deserts? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's of course the logic behind either a quantitative limit or a tax, actually, for that matter. So, what you get is the lowest cost ways of controlling the emissions would be used first. And in the case of a tax, everyone's facing that same price. As you alter that price, depending on the response you get, you tend to control the least cost, use the least cost methods of control first. So that's the logic behind economic incentives, whether you implement them via a permit system or through a tax, as opposed to command and control, which is the traditional method for handling a lot of pollution problems, where you just focus on specific technologies and specific industries where you don't necessarily achieve the least cost method of control. So the general proposition that economic incentives are a better way to go rather than command and control, I think is well accepted by environmental economists, and it really addresses your point that the ability to reduce emissions, whatever emissions we're talking about, at lowest cost, it requires that you have some mechanism for trading off the emissions from different sectors. But that's sort of, once you go to economic controls, you can do that either through a price mechanism or a quantitative mechanism. And then the issue that I was talking about is that there's uncertainty about those curves. And so what sort of circumstances would you tend to favour one kind of economic instrument versus another? And that depends on what you think about the slopes of those, relative slopes of those curves, and evidence that you can get on that. I don't know if anyone else would like to add anything. I think I saw, yeah.
First of all, I want to congratulate the speakers in this session. I felt like in the first two speakers we were listening to evangelical missionaries preaching God's work, but we brought back a little bit of the realism that mere mortals may have difficulty in accomplishing this. But I want to mention one more, and it hasn't been, Rhonda, you were talking about the intersection of economic growth and energy security, environmental protection, all of them very important. But one thing that's been left out of the discussion today is water resources. And could be a huge problem for some of the solutions for reducing emissions. For instance, biofuels is very water intensive, and so is generating electricity for hybrids and electric cars. So it's just one more complication to achieving what are obviously important goals.
I think it was the point we're seeing these kind of unintended consequences be revealed in these policies, which are a lot of new things we're trying to put in. And I think as these consequences get revealed, adjustments are happening. And that's why we really promote this kind of flexible, measured approach, because we will be learning on a lot of fronts as we go down these roads, no question.
The things that you're talking about will extend into 2040, 2050, 2060, at which time perhaps peak oil and peak natural gas will occur. And many of the things that we do now with respect to those two fuels will either be transferred to coal or some renewable source. And I'm wondering how you think about that. You, Roger, for example.
Yeah, I think on that one, again, looking at, everyone hears the statistics on how quickly coal plants are being built in China, and this lock-in aspect, exactly what you're talking about, 40, 50 years, that plant's built, it's going to be used. And to me, that just hastens the necessity to come up with viable CCS solutions. Again, it's like, I worked for a solar PV integrator and installer before coming to Blue Solar. I love renewables. For me, I definitely have drank the Kool-Aid, if you will, on the reality that coal is going to be around. And so with that, as we're installing this new capacity today, it really is that argument of let's get really smart about it really quickly and plan for the 40 years that thing is going to be around. So personally, that's my perspective on it. And but I hear you that with the peak oil piece, things will shift over time. But there's a clear path here today where we can make some decisions to minimize impact, and that's basically what gets me up in the morning. So.
I'm not sure about, well, I am sure about peak oil and people talk about it, but peak gas, I'm not that sure about it, because if you really look at the United States, a few years ago people were saying that within the next 5 or 6 years, certainly by 2015 or so, the United States will be the largest importer of liquefied natural gas in the world, ahead of Japan and Korea. That is not likely to happen now because of the availability of non-conventional gas. So I believe that there will be more gas over the next 30, 40, 50 years. There is a lot of forecasting that is being done right now which suggests that gas will be available. Now, is that going to be the answer? Probably not. I think you're going to need a lot of things. I think nuclear will help in here, and I think we are going to see the revival of the nuclear industry throughout the world. It is expensive, it's got some other issues, but the advanced reactors that people are working on will help and be part of the solution. I think renewable, some renewable with the right incentives will be part of the solution. And also the other things that we talked about before, which is efficiency improvements, etc., will help. So it's really not just one solution, but a multitude of solutions. Coal will be with us. Hopefully by then we will have advanced in terms of clean coal technology to the point where it makes it feasible, attractive, and usable. So at the end of the day, 40 or 50 years from now, we will still have a lot of coal-fired generation, a lot of gas-fired generation, but also a lot of nuclear, a lot of renewables. So it still be a mixture of everything, but tilting more towards clean coal, tilting a little bit more towards nuclear and renewable.
Maybe if I could again have a comment on that too, because I mean, actually, there's no real imminent peak oil problem. If you depends what you define by oil. Okay, so when you talk about conventional oil or low carbon kind of sources of oil, that is more of an issue. But if you think about just getting hold of oil, the United States has huge deposits of oil shale, which you can get oil from that, much more oil than we have conventional oil. In fact, of all the oil shale in the world, estimated resource, about 80% of those resources are in the United States, and they completely dominate conventional oil deposits. But of course, extracting them and using them would produce more CO2. Then, of course, also Canada has huge deposits of heavy oil. In fact, if you look at all the tar sands around the world, about 80% of those are currently known resources are to be found in Canada. So there's a huge amount still of oil around. But you know, there's a question of the cost of exploiting those resources, but also the implications for CO2 emissions. It's another matter, but certainly a lot of oil around. And when it comes to natural gas, as was mentioned, you know, we've been a big increase in unconventional production in the United States, but a lot of that kind of natural gas is probably available elsewhere. Coal bed methane, a lot of other countries have only started looking, and some of the techniques that have been developed for exploiting gas from shale here could also be used overseas. And on top of that, of course, there are other things like methane hydrates, a huge amount of potentially natural gas methane in methane hydrates. So you know, there's an issue. I think the issue as to whether this fuel would be around is not really the question, but the question is the costs of using it and some of the consequences of using it. And the other point about coal, I would say that the point about China, I mean, actually, about the last 5 years, the amount of coal-fired capacity that China added to its electricity system equaled the coal-fired capacity in the United States. So it's not just a matter of what's been done, what's happening in the developed countries. It also depends a lot on what's happening in developing countries. There's some thoughts on responding to that question. Yeah. Okay, so that's time's up. I got the chop off the signal from the boss. So we're going out to have lunch. Thank you very much for our speakers. Thank you.